Hello everyone and welcome back for another MTG Top 10. I'm Aether and I bring you guys a new Top 10 list each and every week. This week we're doing the second part in a two-part series of videos looking back at where I thought cards for Aether Revolt Limited stood before actually playing the format and seeing what has changed since I've actually drafted the format a ton of times. Last week I looked at the cards I underrated, and this week we look at the cards that I overrated. Doing a limited review is never perfect since they're done before the set comes out, but these are the 10 cards that I thought would be way better than they have proven to be since I've started playing the format. Let's get started. At number 10, I have Aegis Otamatone. This isn't a card I thought would be great or anything, but I thought it was pretty medium. But a 2-mana 0/3 can block a lot of things, and the ability can be pretty nice in the late game, letting you bounce creatures into the battlefield abilities, letting you block creatures and bounce them over and over again, bounce your blocker, that is, even triggering Revolt. But it turns out this thing does too little for too much mana. The other automatons seem pretty perfect in terms of design. They're a little overcosted for their size with relevant activated abilities, and they're all solid commons. Aegis Automaton being a 1/3 instead of costing 1 mana less to use, or costing 1 mana less to use the ability, might have made it in the same ballpark as its fellow automatons, but as it sits, it is a pretty horrendous thing to do with your mana, and there are better mana sinks around, like all the other automatons. I've occasionally played against someone who ended up with the right deck for Automaton, and this is a deck that has a need for artifacts and tons of creatures with into the battlefield abilities, but this is rare, and the card for me is almost unplayable. Number 9, I have Silkweaver Elite. In the last list, we noted how much I messed up on predicting how good green cards would be, and you're going to see the same thing here. I never thought the Elite was a great card, but I'm a pretty big fan of creatures who replace themselves. I will play a lot of Elvish Visionaries when I can, and I thought Silkweaver Elite would draw me a card frequently enough to be worth playing in a deck that could really take advantage of Revolt. But I was wrong for a few reasons. One is that it isn't that easy to build a deck that really gets there on Revolt. It can happen, and I've done it, and I've lost to decks that did it, but it isn't like Improvise, which is much easier to piece together. You need to get a lot of things together to make a Revolt deck actually a Revolt deck instead of a deck that happens to have creatures in it with Revolt. It is pretty difficult to play the Elite on turn 3 and get to draw a card off of it, which is where it would be really good. In the latter part of the game, it is easier to pull off, and it isn't too bad there since it provides you a body that replaces itself, but it still isn't incredible. The card, it's worth noting, is not a terrible sideboard card against decks that happen to feature lots of Thopters and Aether Swoopers since it can block those so effectively, but I find myself rarely mainboarding this card, and it is usually one of the first cards I cut when drafting green. This Silkweaver is certainly not elite. At number 8, I have Dispersal Technician. I always love creatures who bounce things, but Dispersal Technician costs a little bit too much for me to want to play it in my main board. I figured there would be enough artifacts around that Technician would be worth it for 5 mana, but there really aren't. A large percentage of the time, the artifacts in play are mediocre to bounce, like Implements or Servos. I do like the card a lot out of my sideboard, especially against people running things like Iron Tread Crusher, and it is a pretty big tempo hit against vehicles in general, who will come back into play unable to attack for a turn. I've played the card in my main deck a few times, but in those situations my draft was kind of a train wreck and I was low on playables. At number 7, I have Cruel Finality. I was pretty high on this card in my set review, and I ranked it the second best black common after Daring Demolition, ahead of both Aether Poisoner and Fenhauler. I thought it seemed efficient enough, and the Scry is some nice value, but the fact is there are lots of X3s in this format, and it isn't unusual to trade down with Cruel Finality to kill something. It does have the upside of being able to kill a creature in combat, but that opens you up to unnecessary risks, like a trick that then really blows you out. I now think both Aether Poisoner and Fenhauler are better than Finality. Unlike the first 3 cards in this list, though, Finality is still a good card, and I think the 4th best black common is still a pretty good place to be. I generally feel good about having 1 to 2 of these in my deck. I just wouldn't take it ahead of any of the 3 black commons that I mentioned. At number 6, I have Caught in the Brights. In my review, I said it was the best white common in the format, and it still is, just not by as wide of a margin as I thought it would be. Triple Kaladesh already had tons of things going against removal like Caught in the Brights. Mainboarded spells that can blow up enchantments and ways to bounce and blink creatures, but Aether Revolt brought us even more of that. It also doesn't stop creatures from crewing vehicles, which is quite a problem. And as a result, Caught in the Brights is not quite a premium removal spell. By that I mean, there is a ton of removal I would take over at Pack 1 Pick 1. Daring Demolition, Chandra's Revolution, Shock, Monstrous Onslaught, Hungry Flames, and I could go on. It maintains its spot as the best white common, but only because white is actually pretty shallow, and the second best white common, Dawnfeather Eagle, isn't all that far behind Caught in the Brights. At number 5, I have Countless Gear's Renegade. I was obviously pretty high on this card. It is a 2-drop that's good at any stage of the game, right? Not so much. As I mentioned with Silkweaver Elite, hitting Revolt isn't as easy as one would think, and as a result, this guy comes down as a 2-mana 2/2 a lot of the time. Now, that's not terrible. It's perfectly fine, just not second-best white common material. I like Audacious Infiltrator, Dawnfeather Eagle, and Caught in the Brights more than the Renegade now, which means the Renegade's the 4th best white common. I'm still perfectly happy to play them, I just don't take them as early as I thought I would, and they come back on the wheel all the time. Alright, now we're getting to the top 4, where I most overestimated how good cards would be. At number 4, I have Iceover. I knew going into Aether Revolt that Iceover had some some serious downside thanks to the fact that it didn't actually tap down creatures when you cast it, but I thought it would be efficient enough not to matter. But not so much. I've been incredibly underwhelmed by the card, and while I play it about half the time I'm in blue, I really only do it if I can't get my hands on better removal in other colors. It has the same weaknesses that Caught in the Brights has, but it doesn't do nearly as much as Caught in the Brights does. In honesty, it is probably something like the 5th best blue common, behind Aether Swooper, Bastion Inventor, Hinterland Drake, and Leave in the Dust. So I definitely thought this card was going to be better than it is. At number 3, we're getting into some more green cards that I screwed up on. Druid of the Cowl is what we have here at number 3, and I ranked it as the 2nd best green common. As you know, if you saw the last week's list, I really underestimated both of green's best commons, Scrounging Bandar and Lifecraft Cavalry, and overestimated how good the Druid would be in turn. Usually mana dorks with serviceable bodies are great in Limited, but there just isn't enough to ramp into in this format for this elf to be quite that good. Now, if you have 4 Lifecraft Cavalries, then this thing is great, and it isn't a bad card even in a world where you don't have a ton to ramp into. But it just isn't as good as I thought. Nowhere near it, really. It has plummeted for me all the way to the 5th best green common, behind Scrounging Bandar, Lifecraft Cavalry, Prey Upon, and Aetherstream Leopard. That's a pretty big drop, especially for a card that I said would be sometimes first pickable. Yeah, it isn't. Not at all. Now let's talk about the final green card I messed up on, one I just mentioned actually, and that is Aetherstream Leopard. I had delusions about this card being as good as Brazen Wolves from Eldritch Moon, which is one of the best red commons in that set, but it isn't even close to being as good. Turns out energy is much harder to make in this format, and the fact that the Leopard only makes 1 for itself is kind of a problem. I'm not saying the Leopard's a bad card, as I just noted I think it's the 4th best green common, but the fact that I had it rated above Scrounging Bandar and Lifecraft Cavalry is laughable, really. It isn't anywhere near as good as those. And, while I'm happy to have a couple of the Leopard in most green decks, I would be happy to replace it with more copies of Bandars or Lifecraft Cavalries. I messed up on green a lot, but believe it or not, the number 1 in this list isn't green. It is a white card, Deadeye Harpooner. This is the card that collectively, those of us who produce limited content were the most wrong about. We all saw it as a card with an enter the battlefield, kill a creature ability and got excited. And we never didn't think it was quite that good, not just like Necrotal. But I certainly thought it would be that about 50% of the time, making it worth a high pick. But it really is something more like 10 or 15% of the time that it actually kills something. The Harpooner just asks too much of you. Not only do you need Revolt, but you need your opponent's creature to be tapped, and lining both of those up on the same turn isn't always easy. What's more, unlike fellow Revolter who kills things, Vengeful Rebel, it only gives you a 2/2 in your fail case, while the Rebel gives you a 3/2 with a more powerful Into the Battlefield trigger. Yes, you can do some silly things if you blink the Harpooner, but it went from being a card that I thought would be first pickable to being a bottom-of-the-barrel uncommon that I don't even think about taking early. If I see one late, I'm usually pretty happy about it, but I will never take one of these early now that I've played the format a ton. Well, that does it for this week's MTG Top 10. I hope you enjoyed these 2 lists. I always enjoy going back and seeing what I was wrong about and giving you guys updated information to help you in your drafts. If you enjoyed this list, don't forget to click the like button. If you have any questions about the list or think there's anything else I screwed up on, let me know in the comments below. And if you want to make sure you catch more of my content, subscribe here and also to another channel called the Aether Hub, where I'm one of the contributors. Finally, my content is sponsored in part by 5colorcombo.com, a great website for your Magic needs. They have an app that can actually help you practice drafting Aether Revolt no matter where you are, and they also have a store where you can use my discount code NEEDSAHONE5 for a 5% discount. Thanks for watching.